All right, thanks everybody. Appreciate you showing up this morning for the opening of our 2018 Manufacturing International Trade Day. I know we have this room set for lunch, and I know there'll be more folks joining us for lunch. If you want to consolidate, come in the middle, that's fine, or if you want to sit where you are, that's fine as well. Welcome this morning. Happy to have you here. I'm Webb Brown. I'm the President CEO of the Montana Chamber of Commerce, and happy to put on another annual event which recognizes the importance of manufacturing and exporting to Montana. We always start our events just a moment of silence to think of those who are protecting and defending us around the world today, if you would, please. God bless them all and keep them safe. I am happy to have folks here. We plan on this event and work very closely with a lot of other people when we put on the show, and I want to make a recognition to our co-hosts, the Montana World Trade Center, Montana Department of Commerce, Montana Manufacturing Extension Center, Montana District Export Council, the U.S. Small Business Administration, U.S. Department of Commerce, and the U.S. Commercial Service. And I think you have a placard on your table, but I will happy to go through the list of sponsors, and we're very happy to have Trade for America as our co-sponsor of the event this year. Bill and crew, thank you very much for your participation, your support in that as we go forward. In addition, at the gold level, Northwestern Energy, Montana State Fund, Boeing, Rocky Mountain Bank, the Washington Companies, and 3M. And then at the silver level, Tohall, VisionNet, Payne West, Town Pump Hotel Group, PDM, LC Staffing, Employers, and Whipfly. And at the copper level, Woods Power Grip, Montana Hydraulics, Blackfoot, Great Falls College of MSU, and the Great Falls Development Authority. We do have appreciation of all of our exhibitors, in addition to some of those that are already named, and hopefully you get a chance to visit them this morning or throughout the day as well. The Manufacturing International Trade Day evolved from an event that used to be just a biennial trade day at the Capitol in 2009 in the current format that we have now. But even before 2009, the Montana District Export Council has been recognizing exporters throughout that time period. We're very happy to start the program today with emphasis on trade policy. And in the past, it's kind of been, I think, traditional, just the typical events and agreements and all of that that's been going on and adjustments. And it seems like the last year there's been an upset of the apple cart, and we've got a whole lot more conversation on trade policy overall. As you know, the Montana Chamber of Commerce has been a long and strong advocate of international trade. We can't eat all of our wheat, and we can't eat all of our beef or use all of the products that all of our folks produce in this state. So not only do we export to other states, but we also export a lot to other countries, and sometimes a bit of a hidden economy. Our greatest trading partner, of course, in many ways, not just numbers, is Canada, and we appreciate Jerome being here today as well. But with our conversations with trade policy, we have had reached out and asked Trade for America to come and join us today, and they immediately jumped on board and said, we'd love to talk. Bill can tell you a little bit more about the organization. His biography is in the program that you have or should have. If you didn't pick it up on your way in, go ahead and grab one. We don't read through all the bios, so we'll let you do that for yourself. But I do want to thank him for his participation in this event, but also in what he's doing for trade policy across the country. Next to him, Jim Peterson. Jim Peterson and I go way back, many years of association through a variety of connections, but happy to have Jim here, and he'll provide some perspective from the agricultural standpoint. Next to him then, Adam Stern. We do a lot of work with Adam he probably doesn't even know about. The certificates of origin that we do, we have a new electronic system to file certificates of origin for shipments to other countries, and most of them require that. Interestingly, long story, Chambers of Commerce have traditionally been the providers of those certificates. I just counted up since we started the electronic version about 2.5 years ago. We've done over 100 certificates of origin for shipments around the world with residents. So it's a fantastic relationship. Besides the fact that he is currently the chair of the Montana District Export Council as well. Jerome Pichella, on the end, thank you very much for being here, Deputy Consul of the Consulate of Canada in Denver. And again, long association, we go back a few years as well. And we're always happy to have you here and visit and bring the Canadian perspective, especially in conversations about NAFTA that we have right now. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bill, let him take over. He'll have a presentation. We'll save our questions until the end of the panel, then followed by Jim, and followed by Adam, and followed by Jerome. We'll wrap up at the end with those questions. So please be thinking of what you'd like to know. We'll tell you that we're doing Facebook Live, so if you don't want it to go out to the world, don't say something that would distribute beyond that. Happy to Alexandria Klopmeyer, who's our communications director, and Eugene, who works with Bill, had set that up. Happy to employ new technology into our program. With that, please help me welcome Bill Lane.
Well, first of all, thanks a lot for inviting me, and I have to say it's really a delight. We're trying to do something different, and let me just give you a little bit of background on why I'm here, and hopefully this is the beginning of something that will cascade throughout the country. If you'll recall last year, let's see if we can. Okay. Okay, if you remember last year, the business community was almost singularly focused on one issue. And the issue was trying to make sure the tax bill actually got into the end zone. That sounds like that shouldn't be all-consuming, but it really was. The administration was doing a good job as far as reducing regulation, but taxes, there's a reason why it was over 30 years since we've had another or a previous tax bill. It took an awful lot of work. It took a fair amount of compromise. We ended up with not a perfect bill, but we ended up something that was, in a lot of people's opinion, better than what we had before. During that time, talk about trade sort of went into the shadows, and there really wasn't an awful lot of talk. There was a lot of rhetoric as far as how trade was not advantageous to the United States, but a lot of the traditional champions of trade were focusing almost entirely on taxes. I was with Caterpillar for over 40 years, and for many of those years, I played a leadership role in our governmental affairs function worldwide. Caterpillar was and still is a big believer in open markets and recognizing that most of its products were sold outside the United States. I retired 2 years ago. In November, I was asked can we work together to bring together the traditional champions of free trade in Washington. And that's the Business Roundtable, that's the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, that's the National Association of Manufacturers, and that's the American Farm Bureau Federation. Bring them together to amplify their voice. They were all participating to one degree or another, but to amplify their voice, and particularly to make sure people recognized how important NAFTA was. Not that it shouldn't be improved, but that it shouldn't be ended. And also the Korean Free Trade Agreement. We came together and we decided we're going to try to do something totally different. Traditionally, almost all the lobbying on trade takes place within what we always call the Beltway, in the Washington, D.C. Beltway. And the feeling is that the real experts on trade don't exist in the Washington Beltway. The true experts in trade are the people that operate on a day-to-day basis outside of Washington and have their own story to tell. And so we've been going around the country asking people what their views are about trade. So we were in Omaha. Actually, we were in Omaha the day it looked like we were going to have a trade war with China, and a lot of soybean producers were there, and they had very distinct views on trade. We've been in Texas. Texas does the most with Mexico, and they were concerned that they could go from a situation where they have a preferential trade agreement with Mexico to one where all their competitors will have a preferential trade agreement with Mexico, and they won't. We were in Spokane. Spokane, surprisingly, they're still really upset about losing the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And as a result, they were talking about how they want to play a bigger role in some of the most dynamic economies in the world, and those are the ones that are on that border of the Pacific. We're in Arizona, views are in Mexico. We were just in Lafayette, Indiana, and there you have a town that has two distinctions. One of which is Indiana has the best business climate in the Midwest, and they're doing very well. And they also have a huge immigrant issue. They have so many Illinoisans migrating to Indiana, they don't know what to do with all the people, but they really have a situation where you really do see that if you get your house in order, good things happen. And that's going to be one theme that you'll see me come back to over and over again, which is the first thing you want to talk about when you think about trade, is that the main focus of all of us should be improving our competitiveness. And there's a lot of ways to do that. And last year we saw some of it as far as better tax policy and fewer regulations. Cheaper energy is obviously a plus. Better education is something we can focus on. Better infrastructure. These are things that have not yet risen to the top of the agenda yet. But we'll talk a little bit about China. We'll talk maybe a fair amount about China. But if any of you have traveled to China, as sensitive as that issue is and how it needs to be treated in a very serious way, there's two things I've always found traveling to China that I actually admired about the Chinese. No country has spent more money on infrastructure over the last 20 years or on education. If you go to any American university, I do a lot with Penn State, and about 4% of our students come from China. And they pay out-of-state tuition, and they're some of our most serious students. That's true with almost all the Big Ten schools. I don't know if it's true in Montana as well, but I will tell you that if you invest in people, if you invest in infrastructure, if you do a lot of the basic blocking and tackling right, trade tends to be fair. When you are not competitive, trade is almost always unfair. So as we talk about these trade relations, we have to always come back to what the Chamber of Commerce is doing on a day-to-day basis, which is trying to make Montana's business community better. Another point, trade has always been controversial. Very beginning of the Republic. The Articles of Confederation allowed tariffs between states. I actually, after seeing the play or the musical Hamilton, I said, you know what? I'm going to actually pull out the Federalist Papers, and I'm sure that's going to be like the Rosetta Stone. And it's going to say, this is the answer. And it turns out that both Hamilton and Madison, they wrote about trade. And essentially, they sort of said, we reserve the right to do stupid things. So trade has always been controversial, and certain parts of the country have always disliked trade, and certain parts of the countries have always liked trade. It's out there. What has changed is sometimes we quit talking about it, and one side gets an advantage over the other. Third, or another point, trade's always, when it is controversial, is in the Wall Street Journal. This is today's Wall Street Journal, but it's never on the front page. It's always like in B section, somewhere in the middle. Today, front page, it drove the market up 300 points. Whenever we talk about trade barriers, the market drops. Whenever we talk about, oh, we're going to put it on hold, or we were just kidding, or whatever, the market goes up. And it goes up and down like that. But our first focus was on NAFTA. And let me just cover this quickly. I don't want to get into one of these presentations where there's a gazillion statistics, but let me just get to a few. One, the U.S. is a trading country. We've always been a trading country. 1 in 5 people, their job is dependent on trade. I know that's true with the people up here. And I bet you at your table, one of you, if we mess up on trade, you're going to lose your job, either as an importer or as an exporter or as a consumer. It's been around. The trend has been sort of flat for the last couple of years, but we've become more and more dependent on trade every year. Well, one other thing, and this is something that constantly we're told That's not what people care about. People care about jobs. That's all they care about. You know, when we go around the country, we found that's not totally true. A lot of folks in the audience actually believe in being a consumer. You know, not everybody exports, but everybody consumes. And a more open economy allows you to have lower prices and more choices. People say that's not important, but it is important. It happens every day. Last night I went out to a restaurant and someone said you can have a wine from Napa or you can have a Malbec from Argentina. And I said, you know, sounds pretty good. I think I'll do Argentina. And did that make me less of an American? I don't think so. It saved me a couple bucks. But, and it made me feel a little bit better. But the point being that we are consumers, we care about prices and we care about choice. Have the trade agreements worked? Well, let me just talk about NAFTA. By all measures, they've worked. Exports went up, imports went up. To Mexico particularly, the average Mexican buys twice as much American products as the average American buys of Mexican products. So you could make the case that if you really wanted a trade balance, you just need more Mexicans. This is really true with Canada. The average Canadian buys more, 8 times more American products than the other way around. We have a slight trade surplus with Canada. We have a robust trade deficit with Mexico. But our economies are integrated, and you know, it has worked. The numbers are there, the stories are there, folks get it. The stat that sort of stands out with me, and I think the thing that's had the most influence with putting a lot of the rhetorical excesses on NAFTA on hold, is when people started really focusing on just how much business we do with our two neighbors. And let me just think of it this way. Mexico buys more American products than the 8 most populous countries combined. So let's think about that. Mexico, with 115 million people, buy more products than China, India, Indonesia, Pakistan, Bangladesh, Brazil, Nigeria, and Russia combined. Canada, with only 38 million people, buy more American products than Mexico. Now, I know you all are good business people. And I know Webb talks about how you have to treat your platinum customers better than everybody else. Mexico and Canada are America's platinum customers. We can have disagreements, but we got to resolve those disagreements with mutual respect. So when you think about the NAFTA renegotiations, there's some things that need to be done. NAFTA was negotiated at a time when there was no internet. We need electronic commerce clauses. Mexico's energy sector was completely closed down. That was one of the reasons they had the revolution in the first place. And now it's open. We need an energy chapter. Content requirements and things of that sort, I'm a believer in letting the auto industry figure that one out, but I have to say, there's things that can be changed that can make things better, but it has to be done in a proper form. These are our two, well, not only are they neighbors, they're allies, and they're enormous trading partners. Now, that little chart there also does one other thing there, is, it points out that we also export more to Mexico than the 5 big economies that are of the G7. So when you think about Germany, now these are the rich countries. When you think about Germany, Japan, the UK, France, and Italy, we export more to Mexico than those countries combined. And then the last one is we also have 18 other countries, which are generally small economy countries, which we have free trade agreements. These are the Chiles, the Colombias, the Australias, the Singapores. And if you put them all together, and you put NAFTA together, that's half our exports. And there's only 400 million people. So the question is, Americans, do you put all your attention on the 400 million people that are buying half our stuff, or do you put your attention on the 7 billion people that aren't buying a whole lot at all? Which gets us to China, and I'll get to that in a little bit. This is just another way of doing it. This is based on per capita. Average citizen in obviously the NAFTA countries buy a lot. It's a fair amount in the other countries. The big, where you see the big deficit is in China. A lot of Chinese. They're a big market as a whole, but they need to buy more products. There's no question. When the president harangues about China not buying enough, there's certainly room to improve. A lot of other facts as far as being a consumer, having a higher standard of living. Interestingly, and I have to be careful how I say this, the guys tend to focus on the jobs. Women tend to focus on the higher standard of living. They're better shoppers. And so more choices at lower cost means an awful lot. We're going to get in, we have a whole series of presentations on how important Canada and Montana are, so I don't want to replicate that. But the one stat that concerned us the most was one of the more influential groups in Washington said if we ended NAFTA today, what would happen tomorrow? And they said within 1 year we would lose 1.8 million jobs. And so why is that? I mean, how could that happen? When NAFTA was negotiated, think about this. The idea was we're going to sell our products into Mexico and Canada duty-free, but everybody else is still going to have to pay Mexico's 10 and 20% tariff. That's going to give us a huge advantage. And it did. And that's why our numbers went up. And then something else happened. Everybody else started doing free trade agreements. They're doing them now. They're doing them in, TPP is part of that movement. But Mexico has free trade agreements with Asia. They have free trade agreements with Europe. They have free trade agreements with Latin America. If we were to pull out now, we would be paying the 20% tariff into Mexico, and they would be getting stuff from our competitors duty-free. So times have changed. That's not saying we can't make things better. We need to make things better. But it also means that we have a lot at risk in the status quo. So let me go to China. China, what has happened politically, and here too, the half-life on information today is a nanosecond. So what I'm telling you right now could be wrong as I'm speaking. But what's going on with NAFTA is people have taken a much more sober approach. The negotiations have been more constructive, things have slowed down, and now there's a feeling, given all of the procedural issues that are ahead of us, that this is going to be an issue that's going to probably happen after the election. Which a better agreement that takes a little bit of time is a lot better than making a bad decision where you lose a lot of jobs. Meanwhile, China, 2 days ago, 3 days ago, we were going into a trade war with China, and China has increasingly taken up an awful lot of the talk at these events. Although I have to say something, we did a radio interview last week, and the issue that took up more than anything else was Cuba. And I think it has to do with the bad weather that we've all been experiencing. And everyone's going, 5 days in Havana doesn't sound so bad right now. And so we talked about Cuba somewhat. But as far as China is concerned, the issue is more complex, and the business community needs to, here to treat this with a more sophisticated approach. Mutual respect is always important, but sometimes you've got to shake things up in order to get results. We don't want a trade war. Everybody says nobody wins a trade war. That's not really true. There's one group that wins a trade war, and those are the folks that aren't involved in the trade war. I mean, it takes decades to establish yourself as a reliable supplier in many markets. China is the biggest potential market. I know the number of people that have worked in China. My first trip to China was in 1994. I went to try to convince the Chinese that American construction equipment would be great on China's Three Gorges Dam. And we were also trying to get the US to think about providing XM funding for it, which they never did. But we were in China, and this Chinese guy, I'm young, I'm sort of, I wasn't sophisticated, let me put it this way, I was sort of rude. And I'm talking to this guy who I'm trying to get to like me, And he turns to me and he says, you know, we like Caterpillar equipment. He said, but the problem is it's better for us to hire 100 people with shovels than one person with a Caterpillar bulldozer. And sort of being snarky, I said, have you ever thought about 1,000 people with spoons? And he got really upset. And then he paused and he said, but you've made your point. Trust me, they're not using spoons today. They're not using shovels today. Their building program is sophisticated, and they've changed dramatically over 20-some years. China joined the WTO in 2000 on terms that made sense in 1998. China is a phenomenally different country today, far more competitive. In the old days, that didn't make a big deal because you just revise the trade agreements every 5 or 10 years. That's what we used to do with GATT rounds. That's a general agreement on tariffs and trade, which preceded the WTO. But today, it's so hard to renegotiate that once something goes into place, nothing changes. So, you know, when people say it's time to revise our relationship with China, they're absolutely right. China doesn't need 10% tariffs like they did 20-some years ago. They need to get their tariffs down to zero. Many of our tariffs are to zero. You know, we can do this in a number of ways. One way we can do it by shaking things up, and that is getting people's attention. The other possibility is working with our allies. They all have the same problems right now as we do. That takes more work, but generally when you do things multilaterally, it works better than when you do things unilaterally. That was true with Iran, that was true with Korea. If you think about Cuba, we always did Cuba unilaterally, and that's been 60 years, 59 to be exact. So my point being, there's lots of ways to do this, but to say the relationship needs to stay static is wrong. We need China to make major changes to open up its market. So what are our choices? One, we can go to the WTO. There's a way to do that. The agreement will provide some relief. It'll take a year or two, maybe 3. It's a gentleman's way of doing things. It's a traditional way of doing things. It won't provide the type of relief that I think everyone's looking at, both from a real terms and in politically, but it's there. The second one was the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which I think someday we will return to. When you think about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, there was essentially 3 things about it. One was it modernized NAFTA. 2, it was a free trade agreement with Japan and a lesser extent with Malaysia and Vietnam. And then thirdly, it opened up new areas, particularly as it related to medicine. I don't know, when you get old, everybody has something, and those biologics have improved my health dramatically. But they had changes that reflected pharmaceutical sales overseas, and obviously e-commerce was there. The other way is a bilateral agreement. There's nothing wrong with a bilateral agreement where the U.S. and China reaches an agreement. And it seems like that's the direction we're going now. The Secretary of Treasury on Sunday said the trade war is on hold for a while, and this gives us time to have a bilateral agreement. And I think it'd be one that would be very favorable to us. And then the last one is a trade war. And trust me, the U.S. and China, you can argue who's going to be hurt the most, but the people that are going to win are the folks that have been waiting a lifetime to take advantage of that market. And let me just give you an example for some of the folks in this room will remember. In 1979, President Carter decided that the way to teach the Soviet Union a lesson for going into Afghanistan was to not allow Americans to sell wheat there. And it was a big market. It was a really big market. And this was before electronic communications. I mean, we didn't have teletypes, but I mean, it wasn't like you go on the internet. In a nanosecond, the Australians, the Canadians, and the Argentines completely took over that market. I was in Omaha and I asked the question, how long did it take to recover? And one of the gentlemen said, we've never recovered. We gave up those markets We've got some of it back, but we've never recovered. Caterpillar made equipment that allowed you to make pipelines. And we had 85% of the Soviet market. And they put sanctions on those sales. It took us 20 years to get that market back. A Japanese company called Komatsu completely displaced us. And while Russia's doing all this energy development, or in this case it was the Soviet Union, all of the work went to Japan. I'm not making a judgment on sanctions per se, but I do know when you do things unilaterally, they rarely work, they're often counterproductive, and they're usually costly to other objectives. If you do things multilaterally, the results tend to be pretty good. And let me just end on a personal note. Some of us were 30 years younger 30 years ago. So I worked in a factory in York, Pennsylvania for 10 years, and I got into governmental affairs, and I'm doing the Free Trade Canadian Agreement. And I really liked Reagan. Oh man, I thought he was great. And I was young. And I used to go to these events, and I'd get there so early. I mean, you would think I was Monica Lewinsky. I was in the front row. And I was just so excited. And so the day they signed the Free Trade Canada Agreement, this was in 1988, it was one of those perfect days. And I mean, blue sky, everybody looked good. The president was at his best. And so they had the presentation. I'm sitting in the front row. And Nancy Reagan's upstairs looking down. It was just the Rose Garden. It was as good as life gets. And so anyway, everybody leaves. So I have a friend, and I walk up there, and I grab the agreement, and I lift it up, and it's just been signed. And two Secret Servicemen just grab me. I mean, and they go, well, anyway, I got the picture before I got grabbed. And I think you could almost see the guy coming at me. And they go, you can't do that. Yeah, that's going to the archives. This is a really important agreement. These are the Secret Service guys. And I'm going, oh, geez, And so from a personal standpoint, in Washington, there's a lot of lobbyists that go, my fingerprints are in that agreement. Well, my fingerprints are actually on the agreement. And I'd hate to see us to go backwards to the point where that agreement leaves the archives. So with that, I'm looking forward to your questions, and thank you very much for the honor of being here. But the next speakers are the real experts and the ones you need to talk to or listen to the most, because they understand trade far more than somebody from Pennsylvania or Virginia. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Bill. That was a very good introduction. Appreciate it. Okay. You all got a pretty good feel, I think, for the trade arena. My name is Jim Peterson. I'm really not here representing anybody but myself. I'm a farmer and rancher from central Montana. My son and I are in the cattle business. I have a ranch that we have a cow-calf operation, a grain and hay operation, and I'm south of Lewistown, about 25 miles out of a little town called Buffalo. My son operates a feed yard at Hobson, Montana. It's called Boss Terra. Some of you may have heard of it. It used to be the Stevenson Basin Angus operation. It has a feedlot that has a capacity of about 10,000 cattle. Average capacity is about 7,500. And we're in the cattle business from the beginning to the end. And we do a lot of grain for the cattle, hay for the cattle, silage for the cattle. And we do yearlings. We buy and sell almost anything as long as we think it can make a profit. And we even have a few Wagyus that we're putting on feed and going to enter the Wagyu market here in August, we hope. But I want to talk to you a little bit about my perspective on the beef industry and why me. I grew up in the cattle business. I'm a native Montanan, but I've spent 15 years outside of the state at getting a couple of college degrees and worked 10 years for the Texas Cattle Feeders Association, another 10 years with the Montana Stock Growers. And in that process, got involved in international trade. I chaired the International Trade Committee for the National Cattlemen's Beef Association for several years, and then had the privilege of going on the board of the U.S. Meat Export Federation that has 12 offices around the world that focuses on U.S. beef, pork, and lamb, and actually was the chairman of that organization for a year, and had the privilege of going to Asia and China and a few times. And so I have a little perspective of the trade side, mainly from a producer's perspective, okay? And I can remember like it was yesterday. December 23rd, 2003, I call her the Christmas cow, when we discovered BSE in the U.S. You probably heard it called the mad cow disease. That was 15 years ago, and we lost our exports overnight. It just disappeared. The cattle market fell by over $10 a hundred in less than a week, and we broke some people. And it's taken us 15 years now through trade agreements like NAFTA, the Korean-U.S. agreement, and more recently TPP, to gain back that export market. We're today now, and we did it primarily by lowering tariffs, okay? The argument was, let us compete with our product. We have the highest quality, most reliable beef supply of any country in the world. Just let us compete. And we were successful with, as you've already heard, with NAFTA, with Japan, with Korea. And today, Japan is our #1 trading partner for beef, followed by South Korea, Mexico, Hong Kong, and Vietnam, which is really China. I'll talk about that later, and Canada. And today, for example, 13 to 14% of our U.S. domestic production of beef is exported. That value equates to $333 per animal raised in the U.S. $333 per animal can be attributed to the exports. And that was in March of the first quarter of this year, averaged about $315 per head. We process about 500,000 cattle a day in the U.S. And when you equate that to cattle, that's 74,000 cattle a day go to export. That's more cattle on feed than there are in Montana. And so it's a big deal for the beef industry. Pork is the same way. We export about 27% of our pork in the U.S. That's up. Last year it was 28% of the pork in the U.S. is exported. That averages about $57 per pig that's processed. So that's a lot of money when you think about it. And the largest pork producer in the U.S. today is Smithfield Foods, and guess who owns them? China. So this whole issue of the tariffs does not make a lot of sense to me. For the first quarter of 2018, our trade with Japan, which is our #1 trading partner, was about even. Mexico about even. But in Taiwan, we were up 34%. This is the first quarter of this year. Taiwan up 34%. Hong Kong 34%. That's China again. And South Korea 36%. And in South America up 22%. That's U.S. beef going to these countries in the first quarter of 2018. So the export thing is a big deal for agriculture. Over 80% of Montana's wheat is exported. About 95% plus of our cattle are exported from Montana, but fed and processed in the U.S. I would love nothing better to have a processor here in Montana because our freight bill to the nearest processing plant from Montana to Utah or Colorado averages about $60 a head. I'd like to keep that right here in the state. That's a different subject. So let's talk about China. Everyone, this whole last few weeks seems to be focused on China. China and the U.S. have about the same land area, 9.6 million square kilometers, about the same arable land. Population in China, 1.4 billion. In the U.S., about 320 million. Or 320 million. The GDP of China is great gross domestic production, about 9.5 trillion. In the U.S., it's about 18 trillion. This data is about 2 to 3 years old now. Per capita GDP in China is $6,800. In the U.S., it's $54,000. So that's the difference between the two countries. And we have this huge trade deficit with China. I understand that, about $200 billion. And so the current administration proposes tariffs on steel. And China comes back and said, okay, that's fine. We'll put tariffs on food and energy. And so now you heard this talk about the trade war. I go to work, can't quite figure things out. Sunday, the Treasury, Steve Mnuchin, says, well, we're going to call a truce on this trade war. And stock market goes up 300 points yesterday. And I'm just going to give you my 2 cents here. This whole trades thing has created so much uncertainty throughout our economy, and particularly in agriculture, that no one knows which way to jump. You know, it's like walking on eggshells, you know. You don't know what to do. And my son and I depend entirely on agricultural production and the prices we can get to survive here. And I think agriculture's sort of become the whipping boy a little bit in some of this, because we spent 15 years with these trade agreements to lower the tariffs so that we could trade competitively. And now all of a sudden we find ourselves in increasing tariffs on steel and them retaliating with increased tariffs on food and energy that we've spent 15 years trying to reduce as an industry. So, and when I think about it, there's not a lot of logic going on here other than this huge trade deficit that obviously needs to be addressed. But I think that my take on all this is, you know, on Friday, this has gotten so political, on Friday the Farm Bill that was certain to pass, according to all the political leaders, failed. And it failed because the left wasn't happy with the food stamp section, which, by the way, is 80% of the Farm Bill, if you don't already know that. And the right wanted a commitment on immigration. So the Farm Bill that sits in the middle fails. So we have the uncertainty of the Farm Bill. NAFTA's been postponed, which is probably not all bad, because we probably do need to think about this a little bit. But I have to tell you, I think we look a little foolish as a country right now, from my perspective. Because what we've been doing for 15 years is the opposite of what we've been doing the last 30 days. And I am nervous, obviously. I am uncertain as to where we're going to go. And I think I represent not just myself, but a whole lot of ag producers around this country that are looking at their checkbook thinking, I wonder how this is going to end. Now, on a positive note, I don't want to close on quite such a negative note, but on a positive note, we do produce the highest quality, safest, most reliable food supply of any country in the world. And if we could reduce the tariffs and let us compete head to head, we'd win. Grain-fed beef will outsell grass-fed beef any day of the week. Now, that doesn't mean people don't like grass-fed beef. I'm not going to say that. But our product, I was in China, and we had dinner with the leading ag experts in China, and you know what they served us for dinner? U.S. beef. I was in Korea when we introduced, I was in Seoul, Korea the night we introduced baby back pork ribs to the Koreans, major chefs in Seoul, Korea. And I thought we were giving Godiva chocolates to kids. I mean, they loved them, and now we can't make enough of them. They sell like hotcakes. Chicken wings, think about that. They sell like hotcakes. My last trip to China, we were negotiating. Senator Baucus was our U.S. ambassador, and we were in China, and I was representing beef on that trip, and we were talking to the Chinese, and the reason that Hong Kong and Vietnam are so high on as trading partners for us is it goes into Hong Kong and Korea in a U.S. box, and it leaves Hong Kong and Korea in a Chinese box. All of that beef goes to China under the table. We call it the gray market. It's called the gray market. And I was trying to make friends with the Chinese and seeing if we could open the market for beef, which finally did open up June of 17, almost 15 years from when we lost our export market to BSE. And I was trying to get this market opened, and one of the press in the room asked me, he said, what's your opinion of the Chinese market? And I said, well, I like the market. There's a huge opportunity there. We're selling a lot of beef to China. I just like to do it legally. And boy, did I get in trouble. That was a Friday afternoon, and Monday morning I was getting calls from the U.S. Embassy in Beijing, the U.S. Embassy in Washington, D.C., saying, what in God's name did you say? What did you say? I said, I just told the truth. I just told the truth. And since that day, we've been telling them the truth. Let's trade, but let's do it legally. Let's just do it above the table, not under the table. And they finally agreed to that last June. And so we've been making some headway. So I'm nervous about the direction we're going right now. Admittedly so. I think that we have an opportunity to really be competitive in the international markets, but I don't think it's going to be done with additional tariffs. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you. Thank you for your talks. Thank you for having me. My name is Adam Stern, and I work for a small photonics company in Bozeman, Montana called Resonon. I am the senior scientist and direct the marketing and sales operations. We have 16 employees at Resonon in Bozeman. We make super fancy, high-tech cameras that are used for industry and research worldwide. Just very briefly, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Resonon and our international business, and then the conditions that we require to do this sorts of business, which I think are good for Montana and good for the United States and the rest of the world, for that matter. So we make these super fancy cameras called hyperspectral imaging cameras, and these cameras, in short, can detect differences amongst anything much better than your eye can. And in particular, you can feed the data to a computer to get automated detection. So, for example, you can point the cameras at the mountains and see where the minerals pop to the surface, or the computer can see where the minerals pop to the surface. Our primary markets are in precision agriculture and environmental monitoring. And so, for example, we can point the cameras at the fields and see where the weeds are, or see where the same crops will have different health conditions. You can detect where the unhealthy crop is separate from the healthy crop, and that can be detected much earlier than your eye can. And the ideal for precision agriculture, at least, is to put these cameras on tractors or airplanes who will then fly over the field. The cameras and computers would detect when a crop needs herbicide or pesticide or water or fertilizer, and then the sprayers would just do automatic spraying in those locations for variable rate application. That's the ideal for agricultural applications. That's still in the research phase. There's professors worldwide working on that, and that technology will be available for industrial farmers in the next decade. Right now, it's not ready to put on a tractor. It's still in the research phase. The same principles hold for environmental monitoring, which is a worldwide issue, flying over, say, forests or wilderness areas and looking for healthy plants, diseased plants, biodiversity, those sorts of things. And then there are many laboratory applications of this technology where they're trying to build the foundations to apply this technology industrially worldwide. And there are many other applications, but these are the biggest applications of our technology, and they're the by far the sexiest ones. So I am the senior scientist in charge of sales and marketing. In a small company, we wear many hats. For years, we just were selling in the United States, and then in 2015, I traveled around Asia to visit the very few international partners we had, and we realized it's a huge world out there, and there's a lot of interest in this technology, and we began acquiring international distributors that sell our products in these other countries. Once we realized that international sales were important and we obtained these distributors, our sales doubled. In 2016, our sales doubled from 2015, and they increased in 2017. And then this year, we're doing very well. We have exclusive distributors all over the world, not sub-Saharan Africa. We did try South Africa, but they have a difficult economic and geopolitical situation. But we're in North Africa, and all over Asia and all over Europe. South America, their economy is improving, and so they're becoming important customers for us. Our largest markets are in China. Our largest market is China, more than the United States. And that is because the Chinese government is investing huge amounts of capital into research to solve some of their most pressing problems, which in this case would be environmental degradation and food production. Our second largest market is the United States, and then we're followed by Japan and Australia. We sell quite a bit to Korea, and then and Europe is increasing for us. Our competition is stronger in Europe than elsewhere. That's where our competitors reside. But our largest markets are in Asia, secondary markets in both the United States and Europe. So the way we sell these, let's see, so 3/4 of our sales go outside North America. One quarter is to the US, and the rest goes to the rest of the world. And the way we sell is we work through exclusive distributors, companies that specialize in selling scientific equipment to universities or specialize in selling scientific equipment to industries. And these exclusive distributors are like having a sales force, an in-country sales force staffed by the indigenous population. And then we as a company, we treat these distributors as our trusted partners. We love them, they love us. They're part of our team. And we've discovered over time, we're decent scientists, but we're terrible business people. But we're learning. And these distributors, it's all about the relationship, the personal relationship. If I can work with you, and we like each other personally, and we can talk truth to each other and drink beers together, then we can understand each other, and we have the potential to do some business together. And that involves traveling to visit the distributors so we can see their capabilities, what they can do, what they don't do well, so we understand what what they do and help understand the culture. And then they visit us as well, which is a lot of fun. I live in Livingston, outside of Bozeman, and when our international partners come visit, we put them up in Livingston. We take them to all the Livingston restaurants, which brings in actually quite a bit of money to our local community, which is a relatively small city. So it makes a big difference. We currently have 23 distributors all over the world, which I might add, we obtained many of them through the U.S. Commercial Services, which was a fantastic help. All right, so that's who Resonon is and what our markets are. And so I just want to say a very few words about what's required to do this sort of business, and then I'll turn it over to Jerome. So what we require to do business is we need to have, well, first we need to have this international communication, the internet. There's no way we could have done this business 20 years ago. I'm constantly in contact with customers and distributors worldwide, exchanging information, looking at data, helping them analyze the data, explaining capabilities. The instant communication is critical. And then, of course, we also need a globalized economy to function. And what that means is, well, we need the communication, the internet and the phones. We need clear avenues of shipping everywhere. For example, we also do a lot of business in India. Shipping to India is non-trivial. We've done business in Russia. Our newest country that we've just gotten into is Chile. And so we need good, reliable shipping everywhere, including those. And then this has proved actually to be quite important. We need a rules-based, legally consistent global financial system so we can all exchange funds back and forth. And that is not something to be taken for granted. And of course, we're definitely subject to the local economic conditions of the countries. Sometimes a particular country's economy is not doing so well. But these sales that we engage in, they can take 12 or 24 months to come to fruition. And so when we get our partners in the countries, we're with them for the long term. And eventually the conditions can change. Chile and Russia are both good examples of that. I think I'd like to just conclude by restating that for us to do good business in the world, we need peace and stability, like most international commerce. We need peace and stability. We need a rules-based system. We need reliable and responsible legislation. And if we have this peace and stability, then that enables us to be prosperous, and it also enables prosperity on the other side of the transaction. And for our scientific equipment, which helps everybody, this type of commerce, we're solving problems worldwide. We're helping others solve problems worldwide. So with respect to all of these trade issues and maybe the larger geopolitical standpoint, the larger geopolitical issues, I think like most people, we're really in favor of peace and stability and working together with other partners in a responsible way, compromising when necessary, understanding the pressures that the people on the other side of the table might be under, and once we understand their pressures, we can help craft our own solutions. And I think by and large we have. The global economy has worked for Resonon, and there's definitely some hiccups going on. So that's what we're required. The future looks bright, and I'm hoping that we can work through these difficulties. So thank you for your time.
Good morning. So I guess I'm the last one. I'll try to be brief. My name is Jerome Pichella. I work at the Consulate of Canada in Denver, and I'll tell you a little bit what a consulate does. But before I start, Webb, thank you for the invite. It's the first time that you have not invited me in January, so I'm really glad about that. Thank you. Adam, congrats on the business. You mentioned a lot of countries, not Canada yet. I'm not going to take it personal, but we can talk after.
I'm in a lot of business with Canada.
Jim, awesome plug for Montana beef, Alberta beef. Alberta beef says hi, just so you know. And Bill, you've covered pretty much everything I wanted to say, so maybe we can talk about the latest Deadpool movie. If you haven't seen it, it's great. And it features Ryan Reynolds and Celine Dion, who are both Canadian. Thank you very much. So what does a consulate do? Essentially, we help Canadians, whether it's individuals that lose their passports or stuff like that, or get in trouble with the law, not that it would ever happen, but mostly what we do is that we support business. So we support Canadian businesses that want to do business in the US, but we also help companies in the United States that want to do business in or with Canada. So if any of you is in that specific situation, please come and see me. I'll be more than happy to help in any way. Now, talking about trade, and I know that we talked about a gazillion statistics, and I do have a few as well, but I really wanted to talk about Montana specifically, and why Canada matters to Montana. You're the only state that borders 3 provinces, and there's definitely a lot of trade. Canada is your largest trading partner by far. Actually, you sell more to Canada than to the 9 following countries combined. It's $760 million annually of sales from Montana to Canada. One thing that we hear a lot about is, trade is bad because there are trade deficits. And I think Montana is the prime example of why the second best liars after politicians and lawyers are statisticians, but they don't know why. Okay, let me give you an example. So if you look on paper, you sell $760 million to Canada, but you import $3.6 billion. You're going to say, wow, that's a huge trade deficit, right? But what happens is, out of that $3.6 billion, there's $2.6 billion, that's crude oil coming from Alberta, entering Montana, but not staying in Montana. That oil then goes either through pipelines or through trucks to Louisiana, to Oklahoma, to Texas, gets refined there. Some is used for US consumption, some is sold to Mexico, a lot goes back to Canada. So that's the reality of business. As far as stats are concerned, it's a sale to Canada, and then it's a sale from Texas or Louisiana or Oklahoma back to Canada. So it looks like you have a deficit, but in reality, you do not, okay? You import about $1 billion from Canada, you sell $750 million to Canada. And then if we add services, and if we add tourism, we've got about 700,000 Canadians that come to Montana every year, and for a reason, it's beautiful. We're about even Steven. So the way you analyze stats and the way you spin stats makes a big difference. And trade deficits may or may not exist, depending what you're looking at and how you're analyzing the numbers. We're talking about NAFTA. We've talked about it really well. Bill made my life easy, but just wanted to give you a couple of stats as well. So if NAFTA was to go away tomorrow, we talked about wheat. Big market, a lot of wheat is exported from Montana to Canada. The tariffs that would be applied to wheat is 76%. Essentially, all the exports would disappear overnight. I met a company from Montana a couple of months ago that works in machinery, in industrial machinery for the oil and gas industry. Alberta and British Columbia is a huge market for them. It's about 40% of their sales. They had no idea that tariffs would be, tariffs of 6.5%, if memory serves, would be applied to their sales overnight if NAFTA was to disappear. Their margin, they told me, is about 5%. So essentially, they would lose 40% of their business. They would probably go bankrupt. And people just don't know that. They don't think about it. Not realizing that, as you said so aptly, Canada and Mexico are your biggest customers. Our economies are fully integrated. There's $1.3 million in goods and services that cross the border between Canada and the US every minute. So if you heard me talk for 5 minutes? That's nearly $6 million. Why do we want to hurt that? We shouldn't. It is true that we need to modernize NAFTA. It is true that we need to get a win-win-win for the three countries. We need to listen to the community. We need to listen to businesses like yourself. What makes sense? What needs to be modernized? Should we try to harmonize the regulations? Should we try to make it easier for goods and people, business people, to cross the border? Yes, absolutely. That's what we're working on. And hopefully we're going in the right direction. I want to make sure we have time for the Q&A. I said I would keep it short. Thank you very much. Oh, I got a plug. One of my clients is there. His name is Patrick Lamoureux. He drove 9 hours to come and be here. He represents about, over a dozen companies from oil and gas, chiefly in manufacturing in Alberta. And he's an all-around great guy. Go and say hi. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all very much for participating, and merci as well to our neighbors to the north. We very much appreciate this opportunity to have some discussion. So there we go. Sorry about that. Let's. I don't know if we have a microphone for the audience, or there we are. So if you have a question, go ahead and hold up your hand, and maybe as one person's doing it, hold up your hand so we'll see where to go next, if you would. And then let's have some conversation about trade policy in Montana and in America. So please identify yourself and your question.
Okay, my name is Kent Ellis. I have a medical device firm called Pentler Medical. My question is to Adam. Adam, as you're doing international trade with product devices, my understanding is the hardest thing to do is you have to be patient to get your money, because many times it's tied to government and it's 6 months to a year for you to get your money. What has been your experience, and what does that look like?
Payment has not been an issue.
Your microphone in front.
Sorry. Thank you for the question. Payment really hasn't been an issue. With our distributors, everything is net 30, and they're our trusted partners. They're part of our team, so they pay out of their own reserves, and they deal with the collections, their own collections in country on their own. Where we don't have distributors, it hasn't been a problem. The only problems we have had are with India, where I think the American style of business does not exactly translate. So you have to have a little more patience in India. And then Russia's been a little bit troublesome. But by and large, everything is net 30, and it works pretty good. I will add, if there is any question about the legitimacy of the customer, we'll go on a 50% prepay.
If I want to add something, the Import-Export Bank in the U.S. is a great way to protect yourself if you're looking for insurance on your receivables and make sure that you will get paid eventually. They're a good solution for you.
I'll add to that. So Ex-Im Bank, for like $300, we can get insurance, Ex-Im insurance, to cover a $50,000 shipment. I will also add that many of our suppliers, we buy high-tech scientific components, and they require 100% prepayment.
In my experience, so but your insurance is through who?
Ex-Im, it's the Export-Import Bank.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, and there is an exhibit outside. They'd be happy to help you give a little more information. Great partner with us as we work through trade issues in Montana. Brigitte here with World Trade Center, very familiar. Wayne with SBA, others can definitely connect you as well. When we're talking policy, we can talk a little bit about Ex-Im Bank as well. As you know, there have been some issues associated with getting the commissioners appointed to the Ex-Im Bank, and right now we're actually limited. We need to get the full Ex-Im Bank board put together to have it fully functioning, which is one of the aspects that we're dealing with on a policy side as well. Another question? Got to have some here. Okay, over either way. Liz?
My question is for Mr. Peterson. How do you see processing working in Montana when companies like Cargill look at processing as a loss leader and have recently closed one of their newest plants, I believe in North or South Dakota?
I think the large processors don't look to Montana as a location for a large processing plant. I think Montana would better be suited for a smaller plant of 250 to 500 a day. That would, with a partner, with then we could do Montana-made products. We have the cattle, we have the infrastructure in Montana, I think, to support a high-quality, smaller processing plant. A group called One Montana did a feasibility study here the last 3-4 years, and it looks like the best feasible size is about 500 per day. Here recently, just in the last few months, there's been a couple of locations identified in Montana. One, if you've been watching the news, this Madison Food Park group, the Friesian family, has been looking at a multiple series of processing plants just outside of Great Falls, and I have been pretty encouraged by that, but then in the last couple of weeks that looks like that sort of fell apart internally, so I don't know what's going to happen there. But the thing that's facing Montana, to be honest with you, for processing is the DOT regulations, where you can't haul a live animal over 13 hours at one time. And we're getting so far away from the processing plants that I know that in the case of the Hutterites, they're having trouble getting their pigs to processing because of the DOT regulations. And in our case, we have to haul cattle to Utah or Colorado to get them processed. That's where most of our cattle are processed, and we could certainly use a small processing plant in Montana. When China announced that they were going to open their country to beef in June of 17, there was a sort of a letter of agreement between them and the Montana Stock Growers Association about the possibility of increasing trade to China on an all-natural product that was sourced and processed verified, and there was some talk about some seed money to build a processing plant. I do think if we could find an international partner that would take 50% of the production, Korea, Japan, China, Japan did that with noodles with Pasta Montana in Great Falls, to where, they process wheat for pasta. If we could do something like that here in Montana with a partner, I think it'd be just so helpful to our economy. And the 95% of the cattle we ship out of Montana for added value some of them could stay here for added value.
And I don't disagree with you, but the numbers don't work for anybody right now. There's really not a sustainable financial model.
Pardon?
There's really not a sustainable financial model that's out there now. I mean, we keep saying that it's just processing. We need more processing, but I'm very familiar with the One Montana study, and it's a tough financial model given the industry's commodity focus.
Well, I don't know that I disagree with that, but I think if you had a partner that wanted to have a Montana product made in Montana, source and process verified, and had 50% of that market pre-sold, then I think the numbers begin to look a little bit more attractive. And I didn't say it was going to be easy, but you got to remember a lot of the larger processing plants are 30, 35 years old, and the beef processing plants are moving toward the north. There was a brand new one just built in Idaho for cows, and that's a partner with a Texas company. And so I still think there's an opportunity here, particularly if you could do something in conjunction with what the Madison Food Park people were trying to do with the 48 Hutterite colonies that are in Montana.
Do you think the Montana beef industry would support source verification?
I think the Montana beef industry, if there was somewhat of an economic incentive, would support source verification. We already individually ID every animal that arrives at the feed yard, and we do it for management purposes. But there has to be a little bit of a government mandate isn't going to get it done. It's going to have to be an economic incentive. And so if source verification would add to an international marketplace to where we could add value, I think it would be easy to sell.
Thank you.
I think in the back, please.
Hi, I'm Wendy Kester, Diversified Plastics, and I have a question for Adam. I'm wondering, because of the highly technical, advanced nature of what you're doing, if you had any concerns about protecting your intellectual property and how you went about doing that, especially considering the number of places that you're exporting to.
Thank you, Wendy. That's a very good question, especially considering China, where our distributor, where companies are pushed, incentivized by the Chinese government to obtain your technology, right? I mean, so our distributor is being pushed by the Chinese government to get our technology. Luckily, our stuff is complicated enough that you have to have, most advanced labs don't have the specialties necessary to reverse engineer what we do. So in that sense, we are protected a little bit. So far, we've just worked on the honor system and the complexity of our systems. With respect to our Chinese friends, they have tried to duplicate some of the machinery that, the accessories that we make, and so we have worked with them. You guys manufacture this to keep costs down. We'll send you the high-tech stuff. You can appease your government. You can keep your costs down. You know, we try to compromise a little bit. That's only been an issue in China.
Bill, do you want to talk a little bit about the importance of the IP standards in any policy, any trade agreement that it advances?
Well,
It's a big issue for us.
I think in many ways, Adam's probably the expert. I mean, you know, intellectual property is everything for your company. And, you know, a lot of times you sort of focus on what you know. And I've put a lot of time in focusing on countries where, when you think about the benefits of, say, zero tariffs. I mean, you know, a lot of it's easy to explain. You're not, a tariff is a tax. You sort of understand the benefits from both a export standpoint and also a consumer standpoint. But a lot of times what you don't sort of put the focus on, what's in it for the other side? I mean, the U.S. has low tariffs for the most part. Other countries have higher tariffs. We both go to zero when we do a free trade agreement, or, ultimately that's what we're trying to do, whether it's with Chile or Australia or with Canada or Mexico. The biggest change, the thing that our trading partner wants more than anything else, is to be seen as an attractive place to invest. And where do you want to invest? You want to invest where there's rules, where there's recourse, where there's dispute settlement, where your intellectual property is protected. And what has happened is the reason why you've seen other countries grow so much quicker if they're part of a trade liberalization regime is because all of a sudden it's a better place to invest. And that's what happened with China. When China joined the WTO, we didn't do anything. We didn't change one law. China did all sorts of unilateral things, and it became a much more attractive place to do business. And they attracted an enormous amount of foreign capital. So, I mean, the importance of intellectual property is important from a company standpoint, and in some cases it's the whole, a lot of companies, that's all they are, intellectual property. But in countries that actually respect it tend to do better. The stat that sticks with me, I mean, a lot of people don't realize our biggest trade surplus is actually with Hong Kong. Now, I'm not going to say they're cheating, but I will defer to the expert at the table. And so, they buy a lot of products. What do the Chinese consumers buy from Hong Kong more than anything else? They buy medicine. Because when you're really sick, you don't want a knockoff. I'm not talking about a generic. You don't want something that has good packaging but doesn't make you well. And they're willing, Chinese consumers, and now there's a lot of middle-class consumers, they don't want something that's not going to make them well. The value of intellectual property is amazing. On the Trans-Pacific Partnership, we have free trade agreements with most of those countries who make up the Trans-Pacific Partnership. There were older agreements. I mean, our first free trade agreement was with Israel, and we didn't even include agriculture. It wasn't what you call a real pristine agreement. And we have a very large trade deficit with Israel on a year-to-year basis. It's mainly diamonds coming into the United States. I don't think anybody really is complaining about that. But if you aren't getting diamonds, you may be complaining. But the point being that these agreements have gotten better and better over the years, and the Trans-Pacific Partnership started taking on things like biologics, which are enormously hard to produce. And it involves an enormous capital outlay. And as part of that, the U.S. insisted not the 12 years intellectual property protection that we have now, but I think it was 8 years or 5 plus 3 or something like that. The point is that's a lot better than what they have right now. And my favorite line of the whole presentation here is, I believe in compromising. I'm like the last moderate Republican left in America. And I mean, I think I compromise so much right now that plaid's my favorite color, and my whole house is beige. And but you know what? Something's happened where a 60-40 compromise is all of a sudden seen as a sign of weakness. I mean, I think we all have to do a lot more compromising, and a lot of that requires us to work together across the aisle and also across borders, whether that's trade borders or whether that's ideological borders. So anyway, I'd like to leave on that.
No,
note.
that's good. Got another question, Brigitte? Did you? Yeah. And Katie, let's see if we can get. No.
Hi there. So I think this question would be for Bill or Jerome, possibly both of you. In relation to NAFTA, kind of ongoing negotiations, I heard Jerome mention, yes, we'd like to make it easier for employees to move back and forth. And, here in Montana, we've got a number of different Canadian firms, and, we have Montana firms in Canada. So I'm just curious, from the Canadian perspective and maybe from the U.S. perspective, are there specific things that we want out of this? Or I don't know what's on track to happen. What would be best case scenario to make it easier for that back and forth? Do you guys have thoughts on that?
So worker mobility is definitely it's a big component of business, as you rightfully said. I don't have exactly all the details on what's being negotiated and what not. What I do know is that it's part of the discussions that have taken place. One thing that's always an issue is seasonal workers, and in Canada especially, it's a political hot potato. I'm not going to lie there, and so I don't know exactly how that's been solved. The TN visas that can be obtained through NAFTA for skilled workers, that's a big issue. That's something that needs to be kept, and that's also something that needs to be simplified. To my knowledge, that's been agreed upon. So that's not going anywhere, hopefully, if NAFTA does stay. Mm-hmm. The whole concept of the various rounds of discussions that our government, your government, has done with the industry is to say what's useful to you. And the vast majority of what's been asked or discussed has been agreed upon. I would say that right now, all the nuts and bolts of the negotiations are completed. The small things, which are actually not so small, they've been agreed upon. There are just a couple of outliers that remain, chiefly for the car industry and the sunset clause, which are preventing the renegotiations from being completed. But what the industry wanted, so the paperwork, the worker mobility, all that, it seems to be going in the right direction.
If I can just expand on that. A lot of people ask, why does a company, or particularly the company I was with for 40 years, Caterpillar, why do you care so much about trade and immigration? And a lot of, you say, well, you want cheaper workers or you want cheaper inputs and things of that sort. It really was never about that. And we're good business people. We believe in a good deal. We believe in compromise. But our biggest concern has always been that we thought we could handle just about anything as long as the U.S. never turns inward. As long as we view trade as an opportunity and not a threat, as long as we view foreigners, with maybe some exceptions, as an opportunity, no, I'm just kidding, but as an opportunity and not a threat. And I think that's our biggest concern on the debate, and I think ultimately it's going to end well. But we need to make sure as a country we're always looking outward and we don't turn inward. Because if we do, all of our problems are going to be hard to manage. Whereas if we're optimistic and we're always outwardly facing, I think there's just about we're going to be able to handle just about anything.
Just to add on that quickly, Bill, the only thing threatening about me is my bad sense of humor. But one thing that you said is very important. It's the safety of the border, okay? So making sure that we can get our businesses growing together and that we facilitate goods and people crossing the border for business should not come at the expense of safety. And there is so much work that's been done since 2001, obviously, by our two countries, and with Mexico too, no matter what we hear. And that safety and business can and do go together. And hopefully we can keep that going.
Thank you. Just a quick follow-up on that, and I still remember in 2001, since you mentioned it, appreciate the Canadians who allowed our people to land in the middle of tragedy. So I very much appreciated this opportunity. Trade is critically important to Montana. And so as part of our new strategic plan, 10 years strategic plan, Envision 2026, trade is one of the ways that we are going to increase our gross domestic product, which is one of the goals of that plan overall. So thank you all for your perspective on doing that. I think a few things that I picked up out of this process is that, number one, you can't sign an agreement and then forget about it. We have to update. We have to modernize these things. We talk about IP protection. The changes that have happened over the last decade, over the last 5 years, could never have been envisioned in some of these trade agreements in the past. So we do need to go back and look at these things. We do need to look at them as opportunities to increase partnerships. Trade is a two-way street, a tired old adage, I know, but it's absolutely true. It benefits us, but it benefits others as well. So we need to keep moving that forward and doing it from a friendly standpoint, not an adversarial standpoint. Now, when no trade agreement is perfect, when there are disagreements, we need to be firm. I would absolutely say that as well, and we need to stick to the principles. But let's look at it as the opportunity to improve the global condition, not just our condition. It is about all of us together working for the future. So thank you very much for your perspective. Thank you for the work. I know it is ongoing. We'll do our part. Thank you for your part. Thank you for being here. And let's keep up the good work. So let's thank our panelists.